Ghost Rider, Book 9, Part 1, Scorpia. Chapter 4, Prisoner 7, page 70 out of 400 and... 450 more like, 430 I think. Oop, I think I just saw it on that page. Yeah, I found it. Prisoner 7. The boy walking along the garden path and up to the front door of the villa was 15 years old, with fair hair that flopped down over his eyes. He had a thin, rather pale face, well-defined cheekbones, and a slender neck. He was wearing jeans and a black sports shirt and trainers. Overall, he was slim, but he was also athletic and had clearly spent time working out at the gym. Well, I think I know who this person was, and I'm going to check. Am I on the right thing? Prisoner 7. Prisoner 7. I'm not sure there's not another Prisoner 7. This is the right. Wow. Here's person. His arms and chest were almost too well developed for someone of his age. From the way he moved, it seemed that he had all the time in the world. He was listening to music on an iPod, the white cable snaking down to his back pocket. It was a warm day, the sun beating down on the well-kept lawn that stretched out on either side of the path. There was a vegetable patch with onions and carrots already poking through, and curling behind it an old brick wall with pink climbing roses and passion flowers. The villa itself was built in the Spanish style, with very pale yellow weatherboarding and blue shutters. As he approached the door, the boy unplugged his earphones and headbird song, along with chug, chug, chug of an automatic sprinkler system. He stood still for a moment. He closed his eyes, and he might be in some quiet corner of England, perhaps a village in Dorset or Kent. But glancing past the garden, he saw the razor wire fence looming above him. 2 guards, both with machine guns, walked past. Once again, he was reminded as if he needed reminding. This was that he was far from home in one of the strangest prisons in the world. Sadly, it was a prison like no other. It had no name. It featured unknown maps. Very few people knew it existed. The staff who worked there, from the governor to the guards to the cleaners and the cook, had been told that if they ever breathed a word about their work, they would end up in a cell themselves. The Felicity had built at a cost of several £1 million and cost millions more to run. And yet, and this was the most remarkable thing of all, it housed just 7 prisoners, each one in his own way, so dangerous that there was a little chance any of them would ever be released. This was the problem. There had been no capital punishment in the United Kingdom since 1964. So what was the government to do with even the worst enemies, the men and women who had been sworn to bring about its destruction by any means? Of course, there were high security prisons such as Belmarsh in the east of London, or a psychiatric hospital such as Broadmoor in Berkshire. But even these weren't considered secure enough for the handful of special cases that had to be kept in almost total isolation. These people who couldn't be allowed to tell their stories, they couldn't be killed, so they had to be put somewhere where they might be forgotten. And so that compound had been constructed, not in mainland Britain, that was felt to be too close to home. Northern Ireland had been considered. There were still prisoners from the old days of the Troubles that could have been adapted. But instead, the overseas territory of Gibraltar had finally been chosen, jutting out of the southern end of Spain. There were plenty of good reasons. First of all, it was still British soil, surrounded by sea on 3 sides, and with a well-patrolled border on the 4th. It was virtually a prison itself. It was very quiet, apart from the Spanish occasion occasionally demanding that the land be given back. Most people would have been hard-pressed to point to it on the map. Most of all, it was a base for both the British Armed Forces and the Royal Navy. There were already military buildings all over the peninsula. Who would notice one more? The prison was high up on the rock overlooked, and the Bay of Gibraltar and the Mediterranean. Or would have done if the wall was 6 meters high and 1 metric thick had got in the way. Electrified razor wire ran inside the walls, so that even a prisoner managed to equip himself with a ladder, perhaps constructed secretly in the prison workshop. He wouldn't be able to place it anywhere close. The position of the fence had been chosen with care. It couldn't be seen from outside, and there were no watchtowers, no armed guards visible on patrol. In other words, nothing gave away the true nature of the complex. Nobody lived nearby, and passing residents, tourists believed that it was a naval communication centre dealing with satellite and internet traffic. Most of the security was invisible. There were almost 100 CCTV cameras and hidden microphones so that prisoners could be observed and listened to from the moment they woke up. And even while they were asleep, movement sensors and thermal imaging cameras provided data 24 hours a day, so that the guards could tell instantly where everyone was at any time. The dozen cells, 5 unoccupied, were built on solid rock, so tunneling was out of the question. But more sensor wires crisscrossed underneath the floorboards anyway. No visitors were allowed. No letters were even sent or received. There was just one entrance and exit, a holding area with any electronic gate at each end. Any vehicle entering or leaving the prison was required to drive onto reinforced glass plates so that it could be examined and searched from all sides before it was allowed to continue. And yet, surprisingly, the prison was a very comfortable place. It was as if the British government had wanted to convince the inmates that it wasn't completely humane. The various buildings scattered inside the walls were low-rise, made of wood and brick, apart from the bars on the windows in the accommodation block. The block was vaguely resembled a holiday village, expression heightened by the flower beds, olive and cypress trees, and the sprinkler system dotted around the dusty, winding paths. The governor's villa was almost absurdly pretty. He was a tough ex-Navy man and lived there with his Spanish wife, but his home could have come out of Disneyland. Each prisoner had his own cell with a bed, a work area, a TV, and a separate shower and toilet. There was a library, a well-equipped gym, a wood and metal workshop, and a dining room. The other buildings included an administration and residential block for the guards, control room, and a punishment block. This was a narrow corridor with 3 rooms built underground. The rooms were soundproof with no windows, but they had seldom been used. No, there was no reason to cause any trouble, and as escape was impossible, no one had ever tried. 7 prisoners. 2 of them were terrorists, not the people who had carried the bombs, but the ones who had decided where they should be placed. They had been captured while planning a nuclear strike on London and had been tried in secret and then brought to Gibraltar. Nobody was ever to know how nearly they had succeeded. 2 were secret agents, spies working for 14 powers. They managed to get deep inside the intelligence services before they were unmasked. And it was what they knew as much as what they were that made them dangerous. One man, the oldest in the prisoner, claimed that he had been a weapons inspector in Iraq and was innocent of any crime. Nobody believed him. The 6th man was a freelance assassin. There were very few pages in his file. He never revealed his name, nationality, age, of the number of people he had killed. But it was the 7th prisoner, the 15-year-old boy standing in front of the governor's villa, who, without doubt, was the most remarkable. In fact, he was almost unique. Not born, but created, given a face that wasn't his own. taught how to kill, and quite insane. His name was Julius Grief, and he had been one of the 16 clones created in a French laboratory by his natural father, Dr. Hugo Grief. A clone is an exact copy of a human being, manufactured by taking a single cell and cultivating it inside an egg. Julius had not only never met his mother, he didn't really have one. Until he had been born, cloning had been restricted to laboratory animals. The most famous had been Dolly the sheep, but using technology which he had developed first at the University of Johannesburg and later at South Africa's Minister of Science, Grief had cloned the first human beings, 16 replicas of himself. They had all grown up together at Point Blanc Academy at Castle high up in the French Alps near Grenoble. Dr. Grief had been planning to take over the richest and most powerful families on the planet by kidnapping their teenage sons and placing them with his own brood. One by one, the boys had been given painful and permanent plastic surgery making them identical to their targets. None of them had complained. This was the purpose of their entire life. This was what they had been created for. They had never had proper identities of their own. Even their names had been chosen to this end. Each one of them had been named after a great world leader. Julius had come from Julius Caesar, the Roman emperor, and there had been other boys named Napoleon, Genghis Maotes, even the 16th, Adolf. As things had turned out, Julius had been the last of the boys to be given a new identity. He was to be Alex's friend, the son of Sir David Friend. A man who had made a fortune from supermarkets and artilleries. He was going to live in a huge house in Lancashire in the north of England. He would go riding and shooting with his aristocratic friends. It would be amazing. One day after he had murdered Sir David and his family, it all belonged to him. And so Julius had undergone surgery. He had begun to learn his new role, how to talk like Alex Friend, how to walk like him, how to be him. And then at the last minute he discovered the terrible truth. The boy he was watching day and night, the one he was modelling himself on, was not Alex Friend at all. He was incredible, the spy working for British intelligence. Julius Grief had been given the wrong face, the face of Alex Rider. Worse to follow, Alex had escaped from Point Blanc, only to return at the head of an armed force. The school had been destroyed. Dr. Grief had been killed. Julius managed to escape and had tracked Alex down to his school near Chelsea. But even though he had surprise on his side and a loaded gun in his hand, Ryder had managed to get the better of him. Julius remembered the fight on the roof of the science block, the fire plunging down into the inferno. He could still feel the burns that had started at his neck and crisscrossed his body all the way to his thighs. He spent 2 months in the hospital and the pain would be with him for the rest of his life. He was reminded of it every time he caught sight of his reflection. He still had Alex's face. It drove him mad when he cleaned his teeth. In the morning there it was, in the mirror, smiling back at him. If he passed the window at night, the ghost of his enemy would glide by beside him. After a heavy rainfall, Alex Rider would look up at him from the puddles. And there were times when he wanted to tear his face off with his nails, and in his early days at prison, he had tried to do exactly that, leaving deep scratches down his forehead and cheeks. That was when they had decided he needed psychiatric help. He was on his way to the next appointment now. Julius Grief reached out and rang the bell at the side of the governor's front door. He was expected, of course, but it was against regulations to enter without ringing. The bell sounded both inside the villa and in the control room. The camera had already picked him out. One of the guards was checking that he was meant to be an 11 o'clock appointment. He was exactly on time. The door opened and a short grey-haired woman looked out. As always, she was wearing dark colours, with a white shirt buttoned to her neck, and very little jewellery. She could have been the headmistress of a primary school in some remote English village. She was in her mid-40s with a pinched face and a slightly turned-up nose. Her name was Rosemary Flint, and she was a child psychiatrist. Did I say child? Yeah, child psychiatrist. She had been meeting with Julius twice a week for the past 6 months, talking to him in the living room of the governor's house rather than in the library of his cell, because she hoped the homely atmosphere might help. "Good morning, Julius," he said. She had one of those annoying voices that were always sweet and reasonable. Somehow you knew she would never lose her temper. "Good morning, Dr. Flint," Julius replied. "How are you today?" "I'm very well, thank you." "Come in." They had spoken almost exactly the same words 50 times, and Dr. Flint had noticed that not once the boy's expression changed. He was coldly polite. His eyes were empty. She had never told Julius this, but that part of her job was to decide if there was any chance he could one day be released and return to society. After all, it wasn't entirely his fault that he was what he was. That was what he had been made. Someone in British intelligence had that he could be turned around and might eventually lead a normal life. But as far as Dr. Flint was concerned, the day was still a very long way off. She led him into the living room and gestured towards a large, comfortable sofa covered with a flower-patterned fabric. There was no need for the gesture. Julius sat in the same place every time. The governor's wife liked flowers. The room had flowery wallpaper too, and there was a vase of roses cut from the garden on a low, dark wood table. The curtains were thick and kept out much of the sunlight, even when they were open. An antique mirror had once hung on one of the walls, but Julius had smashed it in the middle of his third session. The governor hadn't been pleased, but Dr. Flint insisted that there should be no punishment. In her view, the boy wasn't responsible for his actions. She thought of him, at least in part, as a victim. A painting, a view of Caius, now hung in Mirror's place. "Would you like some orange juice, Julius?" Dr. Flint asked. "No, thank you," Julius replied. He never drank or ate anything during these sessions. Dr. Flint had tried biscuits, chocolate, coke, and cream cakes, all without success. She knew exactly what was going on in his mind. To take anything would be given her power over him. She might set the rules, but he was playing his own game. One day she hoped he might accept a Jaffa cake. Then at last he would know that the healing process had begun. How has your week been? How has your week been?" "I've had a very good week, thank you. Reading everything from the prison library. I've just started War Horse." "That's excellent, Julius. You should try to read as much as you can." He smiled. "What's it about?" "Some shooted horses that get killed in the war." "Aren't you enjoying it?" "No, not much." Dr. Flint sighed. The boy was lying. She knew every book he had borrowed and every book he had read. He was the only teenager in the prison, and there wasn't many things he could do with his time. He devoured books, but when he was put with her, he pretended otherwise. "Have you thought more about what we spoke of last time?" We discussed a lot of things, Dr. Flint. "We were talking about anger management." "I'm not angry." "I think you are." Julius didn't answer, but he could feel something burning white hot inside him. It wasn't anger. How could a stupid woman describe it like that? It was like modern lava flowing through his intestines. It was like acid. He looked down deliberately, knowing he would be unable to keep the emotion out of his eyes. Dr. Flint would spot it, and she would write it down in the notebook of hers. She wrote everything down, as if she could even begin to understand him. He was lucky she couldn't see into his imagination. Judas dreamed of killing Alex Rider slowly, painfully. He should have done it on the school roof a year ago. He had come so close, and he might have get another chance. Julius thought about the note he had found the night before. It had been waiting for him, hidden in his room. Incredibly, impossibly. He had read it so many times that he knew every word off by heart. But he quickly forced it out of his mind. The woman was still examining him. He didn't dare give anything away. "Thought we might try some word association today," Dr. Flint said. "Whatever you say, Dr. Flint." It was her favourite game. He said one word, he had to say another instantly without any thought. He was supposed to demonstrate what was going on in his mind. "Right." She looked around her. "I'm going to start with something very ordinary. You know what to do." There was a pause. Then she began. "Dog bone. Kitchen knife. Handle blade. Grass dead body." Dr. Flint stopped. "I don't understand the association," she said. "When you said blade, I said grass, but I was thinking of a blade of grass. When you said grass, I thought about burying someone underneath it." "Who do you want to bury, Julius?" Julius didn't answer, but they both knew whom he had in mind. "Let's try again," Dr. Flint said. For the first time in her career, she began to wonder if there was any point in continuing. She had been working with her for months, and she had made no progress at all. She touched her lip. "Mouth, throat, drink, poison, bottle, message, letter, bed." She stopped a second time. "That was a little better," he said. "You were thinking of a message in a bottle, I suppose, but why did you say bed?" Julius was cursing himself. He couldn't get the message out of his head. He had found it under his pillow when he went to bed. Someone must have placed it there during the day. Now he had almost let it slip, throwing out words without thinking. Of course, slightly a headache. "Mind if we don't play this anymore?" he said. "Of course, Julius. You want to have a rest?" "No, Dr. Flint. Only a few minutes of the session had passed. We still had a whole hour together." Julius wondered if he would be able to get through it without screaming at her or even trying to break her neck. He had thrown himself at her once early on his therapy, and after he'd been dragged off, they put him in the punishment block for a week. Couldn't let them happen now. The message, the secret friends, they wouldn't keep him waiting long. He just had to hold everything together until the right time. "All right, why don't you draw some pictures? I'd like to draw some imaginary place, and then you can take me through it and tell me what you can see." Julius had an imaginary place. It was a forest with Alex Rider hanging from every tree, nailed to every trunk, buried up to his neck in the mud, lying bloodily and unconscious in the grass. A whole world of Alex Riders, each one suffering in a different way. "Can I draw a funfair?" he asked. "Of course, Julius." Even as he picked up the child's crayon that had been supplied for him, he thought about the moment he had lifted up the pillow and seen the single folded sheet of paper beneath. He had known at once that it was something special. Nobody ever came into his room uninvited. No, the other prisoners weren't allowed. The guards at Cleveland made a point of asking his permission. He had unfolded it and read, "We are your friends. We are preparing to help you escape. Go to the library tomorrow at 12 o'clock, and you will find further instructions." Words had been neatly typed. Instead of a signature, there was a little emblem printed in silver at the bottom of the page, a scorpion. Julius had read the note a dozen times, then crumbled it into a ball and swallowed it with a cup of water, which he had drawn from the tap. After that he had gone to bed, but he hadn't slept. "We are your friends." Who? He had no friends. He'd be some of his brothers. Julius had never found out what happened to them after putting the law academy, and he had been checked out. He had assumed that they were like him. Prisoners. Perhaps he had been contacted by people who know his father. They might be from the old South Africa. Tomorrow at 12 o'clock. Tomorrow was now today. It was already 10 past 11. Just 50 minutes ago. Julius' grief forced the image of Alex Rider with a kitchen knife in his chest, his bones exposed, lying in the grass. Then under the grass, out of his mind, and began to draw a merry-go-round. Dr. Flint watched him, and of course she didn't know. Nobody knew. This was the day he was going to escape. Chapter 5. Over the Edge. The library was the most modern building in the prison, and although it was unusually small and compact, it could have been lifted out of almost any provincial town in England. It was a low rise with red bricks and sliding glass doors, and contained about 300 books, half English, half in Spanish. For the guards and their families used it too. There was a desk where books had to be assigned in and out, a newspaper and magazine section. Although all the publications were carefully censored, then the books themselves divided into usual classification, crime and horror sections were the most popular with the prisoners. New books appeared occasionally, mainly sent by charities. When Julius Grief had arrived, the governor had personally set up a children's section, purchasing the first book, a complete collection of Roald Dahl with his own money. Julius headed to the library. As soon as his session with Dr. Flint was finished, crossing open space where some of the other prisoners were enjoying the sun, sitting on rickety chairs between trees. The two terrorists were playing Scrabble. As Julius walked past, one of them noticed him and nodded vaguely in his directions. He had made the word J-I-H-A-D, and with the J on the triple letter, scoring 36 points. The assassin was nearby reading a celebrity magazine and circling some of the heads with a black felt tip pen. The other prisoners didn't really like having a teenager among them. It offended their sense of dignity. Julius had to force himself not to hurry. He knew that his every movement was being watched, and that any strange behaviour and any indication that he was planning something would be reported immediately. He even hesitated before he went into the library. If he wasn't sure whether he needed a book or not, he pretended to make up his mind. He passed through the glass door. Buenos Dias, Julius. The librarian was a Spaniard who also worked in the prison accounts. His name was Carlos, and he was plump and good-natured, dressed in the same uniforms as the guards, an olive green shirt and dark trousers. You are coming to the talk tonight? Looking forward to it, Judy said. There were occasional talks in the library given by the prisoners or by guards. 2 weeks ago, one of the secret agents had spoken for an hour on the Cold War. Tonight, the chef was demonstrating his mother's paella recipe. What is it you want? Come to borrow a book. Carlos glanced at his computer screen. But you already have 3 in your cell. I know, but I finished 2 of them, and I'm not enjoying the third. Julius walked toward the bookshelves. 3 of the librarian's eyes boring into his back. What exactly was he looking for? Nobody told him to come here. Where do you find further instructions? Apart from Carlos, there was no one else in the building. Would there be a second letter hidden somewhere? If so, how was he meant to find it? He decided to head for the children's section. After all, that was where they would expect him to go. He stepped in for the shelves. The doll collection stretched from one side to the other. Julius had never read any, though he had once come across one of the terrorists with fantastic Mr. Fox. As far as he could see, nothing had changed since his last visit. He could even make out the gaps where he had pulled out his own choice of books. Then he saw it, one new book, lying flat on its side, a fat, dusty-looking hardback wood, Wildlife in Gibraltar, Volume 2, Birds and Insects. It shouldn't even have been here. It should have been on the other side of the room. In natural history, but that wasn't what he scored his height. It was the cover. There was a picture of a creature that seemed to be gazing at him with its tiny eyes. It couldn't just be a coincidence. It was a scorpion, the same image that had appeared on the note. He glanced round. Carlos was sitting, tapping at his keyboard. The librarian seemed to have forgotten him. The still cameras mounted in all 4 corners of the room. They would be watching him from the control room. He was put on a performance for their benefit. He took out one book, then another, then considering which to read. Finally picked up the Wildlife volume and carried it over to a table. He had chosen the position carefully. The table was right next to the shelf, screened in from the cameras. Carlos could still see him, but he was very certain that the book was out of sight. Very carefully, he opened it and gasped, How could this have happened? Nobody knew about the prison. No one could possibly infiltrate it. Yet there it was in front of him. The pages of the book had been cut out to provide a hiding place for a gun. A Morse C 97 semi-automatic pistol with a barrel shortened to allow it to fit. Julius tried to think over the gold medal. He had been taught to shoot when he was 9 years and he was killed for the first time when he was 11. It was more than a year since he had held a gun in his hands. He had thought he would never have one again. For a moment he had urged to pick it up, turn around, and shoot Carlos in the head. That was crazy. He had to be sensible, to do this one step at a time. There was a second note folded into the book. It was much longer and more detailed than the message he had received the night before. Julius read it very carefully. Whoever was helping him, these were serious people. He knew he could make a mistake. Finally, he was ready. He closed the book and stood up. It was 12:30, exactly the right time. He knew what he had to do. Grief. He knew what he had to do. The subject had made no progress at all since his arrival in Gilberton. It was clear that Julius' grief had a pathological hatred for Alex Rider, which is deep-rooted and permanent, and yet at the same time surgery has made him identical to the object of his hate. It must surely follow as the subconscious sum of the hatred that might veer directly against himself. In my view, there is a real danger that this pathological turmoil could drive grief over the edge, and that he could plunge into desperation, suicide, or total nervous breakdown. Indeed, it is surprising that it hasn't happened yet. Dr. Flint looked at what he had just written and felt a deep sense of gloom. She had been working with damaged children for her entire professional life, but had never met anyone like Julius. Julius' grief. She wanted to feel sorry for him. He wasn't responsible for what he had become. He had been manipulated from the moment he was born. In fact, even his birth had been manipulated. He was a freak, created for one purpose only, to help his father take over the world. He had read the file on Hugo Weave to make her shudder. All 16 boys had been drip-fed a diet of hatred and insanity. All of them, apart from two who had died, all ended up in an institution like this, locked up for the rest of their lives. It wasn't their fault, and yet, no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't avoid the fact she had a deep dislike for Julius. She knew it was unprofessional, but at the same time it was almost instinctive. He was a horrible person, and she wasn't fooled by him either. Although he went along with her methods, the discussion, the word association, the different physiological tests, she knew that he was toying with her, and he was keeping something back. Even this morning she had been aware of it. He had tried to hide it in his expressionless face and his flat, formal answers. There had been moments when he sensitive, flickering at the corner of his eye, like a moth in candlelight. There was something he wasn't telling her. He wondered if he could mention it to the governor, but decided against it. She was the boy's therapist. She had to respect his confidentiality. She went back to her notes. I recommend that Julius should be put back on medication with immediate effect. Although I do not like drugging young people, I feel like that it is his case. The doorbell rang. That was surprising. The governor never came back before 2 o'clock, and his wife was out for lunch. Dr. Flint went over to the small television screen in the hallway and saw a black and white image of Julius standing outside holding a bunch of flowers, which must have been picked in the prison garden. She was tempted not to open the door. He shouldn't be here. He was against regulations. She remembered how he had tried to attack her in one of their first sessions. There had been the time when he had gone berserk and smashed the mirror. She should tell him to go away. She reconsidered. All that had been months ago. Maybe he was really trying to make amends for his behaviour that morning. Maybe he had to come tell her what was on his mind. The flowers were a sweet touch anyway. There were dozens of cameras that would be trained on him even now. There was no danger. She opened the door. What is it, Julius? She asked. It's very difficult to explain, Dr. Flint. When they come back inside, no. As a matter of fact, I'd like you to come with me. Where do you want to go? We're leaving here together. He dropped the flowers, and there it was in his hand, pointing at her. Dr. Flint stared in shock. Julius Griff was holding a gun. His finger curled on the trigger, a glazed look in his eye. It was like something out of a nightmare. It made no sense at all. How could he possibly have a gun? There was something horribly inevitable about it. Julius was managing to contain the excitement. He was in total control. Dr. Flint knew that if she didn't do exactly what he said, he would shoot her without a second thought. He stepped forward, and suddenly the gun was at her throat. His face was close to hers. He could feel his madness as if she had been slapped with it. He was as tall as her and a great deal stronger, for he was armed. For the first time since he had known him, his face had cracked into something resembling a smile. Suddenly he was no longer 15, and the good looks of the lad that the plastic surgeon had given him were twisted out of shape. He would have been 50 or even 150. Eve has no age. Dr. Flint was terrified. Had she really spent the last 6 months twice a week on home with this monster? I'm going to walk out of here, Judy said, and his voice was even soft, though it was on the edge. He said, walk, 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 walk. You're going to come with me. They'll never let you through the gates. Judy pressed the gun into the side of her neck, the sort of muzzle pointing upwards, and then they'll be scraping your brains off the fence. He told her. Shall we go, Dr. Flint? I think we should. They walked together like two lovers, performing some strange sort of dance. Dr. Flint was staring straight ahead, her head tilted. Julius was enjoying himself. The feel of the gun in his hand was giving him strength. He loved the way the hard steel was pressing into the woman's flesh. For months he had endured her stupid questions, the endless mindless game, and now at last he was the one in command. But all the cameras, Julius Grief and Dr. Flint had almost reached the first gate holding area. Before anyone realized that something was wrong, perhaps they thought some of exercise, perhaps part of the therapy. Finally someone saw the gun. Realized what was going on. At once long rehearsed emergency, Realized sprang into life. A dozen sirens went off, their combined sound echoing all over the peninsula. Guards burst out of the doorways, their weapons ready. The other prisoners were rushed at gunpoint back into their cells. An automatic phone message was sent into Devil's Tower Camp, home of the Royal Gilberty Regiment, close to the airport, calling for immediate backup. Before Julius had even had a chance to make his demands, half a dozen Land Rovers were speeding out of the garrison, and beginning the long climb uphill. For a moment everything froze. It was as if the entire compound had become a photograph of itself. Julius Grief was still holding on to Dr. Flint on a hand on her shoulder, the other with a gun pressing against her neck. He was surrounded by rifles and automatic machine guns. They were aiming at him from every direction. The sun was still beating down, glinting off the razor wire fence. Somewhere outside the prison there was a brief chatter of laughter as one of the island's famous apes swung itself off the branch of this tree and disappeared into the undergrowth. Then the governor appeared. He was a stocky, muscular man with grey hair, cut short, dressed in army fatigues. He had been in the control room when the alarm was sounded. He stopped in the holding area on the other side of the first gate. Grief, he barked. He had been in the Royal Navy for 20 years and had a sort of voice that he was used to be afraid. What do you think you're doing? Open the gate or I'll put a bullet in her. Julius was loving this. He could feel the world spinning at him. I'll kill her, I promise. Where'd you get the gun? Julius wasn't going to answer. 5 seconds, he called out. You're not going anywhere. 4. The governor made his decision. He had no doubt at all that Grief would use the gun. He could see that Rosemary Flint was terrified. The guards were waiting for his command, but he couldn't let them fire, not unless they wanted to kill the woman too. How this boy had even have possibly got hold of the weapon? Was it even real? He couldn't take the risk of finding out. Dr. Flint was a civilian. Our safety came first. 3 seconds, Governor. And now the boy had the upper hand. But they were chained on the other side of the prison gates. Backup would have already been on its way, and Julius Grief hadn't worked it out properly. He had nowhere to go. He was high above the main city, any harbour with narrow lanes and hairpin bends all the way down. He wouldn't be able to get Flint and keep Flint close to him all the time. And even if he made it to the bottom, there's nobody he could leave the peninsula. Nobody was going to let him board on a plane or a ship. The Spanish border authorities would already have been alerted. Everything was on the governor's side. Once Grief was out, it would be easy to pick him off. Open the gate, Julius shouted. His face was deathly pale. His arm and the hand with the gun were rigid. Even if someone did shoot him, he would still manage to kill Dr. Flint before he died. Do what he says, said the governor. Do what he says, the governor called out. For a second, nothing happened, as if guards couldn't believe what they had just heard. Then there was a click and the heavy gate began to roll aside. Julius grabbed hold of Dr. Flint's collar and dragged her forward, the two of them moving side by side, the guns followed them into the holding area. Then at the inner gate, slid shut, and now they were trapped inside a pen with fences on 3 sides, a sentry box on the 4th. The governor had retreated, and was trying to get as far away from the scene as possible. The young guard stared at him from behind a plate glass window. Nothing like this had ever happened before. Prison. Julius, Dr. Flint rasped. It was hard for her to talk with the gun pressing against her throat. Don't do it, it's not going to work. I would very much enjoy pulling this trigger, Julius replied. In fact, I love it. If I were you, I'd shut up, Dr. Flint. Don't give me an excuse. The second gate opened, and for the first time, Julius was able to see little olive groves. The second had boulders and wild grass on the other side of the gate. Distance he glimpsed the Mediterranean, a twisted ribbon of blue. Off we go! He forced Dr. Flint forward. This was a critical moment. He knew that as soon as he left prison, he would have to get rid of her. She would only slow him down, but that would be when he was most exposed. The guards wouldn't hesitate to shoot. Julius putting all his trust in the people who had sent him his instructions, and he had no idea who they were. If they tricked him, if they failed to deliver, they would be killed. But in a way that he didn't care. Better this 1 minute of freedom than a life behind bars. Julius and Dr. Flint passed through the outer gate, and now the prison was behind them. Julius' grief had been brought here in a blacked-out van, so he had never seen the view. And now a track ran downhill past some small concrete buildings like pillboxes from the Second World War. The ground was dusty and covered in pine needles. He could smell pine and eucalyptus in the air. There were nobody in sight, but the letter in the book had warned him that he would only have 5 minutes before the Royal Gibraltar Regiment Land Rovers reached him. He had to move fast. He swung his arms, cracking the mortar across Dr. Flint's head. She cried out and fell to her knees. Julius twisted around and fired 3 shots at the prison gate, the bullets ricocheting off the metal. He hadn't hurt anyone, but it would certainly give something to think about. Certainly nobody would choose to come running out of the next few seconds. All he needed was time to get. He began to sprint down the hill. He had kept himself fit while he was in prison, not because he had anywhere to go, but that was how he had been brought up. His father, Hugo Greene, insisted on 6 hours exercise a day, starting with a 2-mile run through the snow. They had learned martial arts, they knew how to kill, and he had taught them how to drive. The car was waiting exactly where the letter had said it would be, parked off the track, hidden behind a cluster of the date palm trees that was dotted all over Gibraltar. It was a small sub in Suzuki Jimmy, cheap and box-like and covered in dust. One ring was crumbled, the driver's mirror was cracked, it looked abandoned, but the door was unlocked and the keys were in the ignition. Julius scrambled inside. At the same time, he had a car rush past on the track, heading downhill toward the prison. Fortunately, the driver hadn't seen him. Someone shouted. The guards were spreading out on the foot as well. It wouldn't take them long to find him. He slammed the door and turned the key. The 1.3 slider engine rattled noisily to life. The guards weren't expecting him to have a car, but they must have heard the sound and would now know. If they had already guessed, they had expected this escape to be planned. With help from outside, Julius jammed the car into reverse and then shot out onto the track. The wheels spinning and sent out clouds of dust. The Suzuki handled badly and would struggle to get around the curves. Still, it was better than walking. A shot rang out, slamming into the bodywork just above the rear tyres. One of the guards had seen him. Julius shoved the gear stick into first and accelerated. The Suzuki leapt forward, and even as the guard fired again, his second shot splintered the branch of the nearby tree. Julius was hunched over the wheel. There's another guard in the track ahead of him. How could he have got there so fast? As the guy brought out his gun round, Julius floored the accelerator. For a brief second, the guard filled the windscreen. Then the car struck him, and there was a sickening thud as he was thrown into the air, the gun spinning out of his hand. Julius was 10 meters down the road before the man hit the ground. There were 2 prison jeeps behind him. He could see them in his rear view mirror. They were faster than the Jimmy, getting closer by the second. If he hadn't been driving downhill, they would already have caught him. Just ahead, the track curved steeply to the right. He spun the wheel, and suddenly he was on the very edge of a 100-meter sheer drop. He saw the huge rocks in the sea far below. He felt the tires slipping off the track, grit and loose pebbles spraying out. He fell back with the steering wheel, forcing the Suzuki back under control. By the time he had rounded the corner, he had put some distance between him and the pursuing vehicles. He had almost killed himself. The next corner was easy. It went to the left, so this time the car was hugging the cliff face away from the sea. Even so, Julius miscalculated as one of the wing mirrors disintegrated against the rocky outcrop. The jeeps were catching up against two, and looking ahead, he could see the fleet of Land Rovers beginning to the Royal Gibraltar, which went climbing towards him. There was no way down, there was no way back. The next hairpin bend, she dropped certain death lay straight ahead. Julius wrenched the wheel to the left, to the right. The driver of the nearest jeep saw the Suzuki leave the road, weaving across a patch of scrubble towards the dilapidated barn. The boy was out of control. He tried to steer the car back onto the track, but instead it smashed straight into the barn door, disappearing in a blast of shattering wood. The next few seconds the car was out of sight, inside the barn, but then it reappeared, breaking through the rear wall. The bonnet crumbled, the windscreen now a spiderweb of cracks. Julius' grief could only be glimpsed, staying out of a ripped smile, his fair hair sweeping down over his eyes. His hands glued to the steering wheel. There was nowhere to go. The vehicles from the barracks were taking up position lower down the hill, blocking the way ahead, with the rocks on one side and the sheer drop on the other. There was no way past. Julius didn't even try. Perhaps he couldn't see. Perhaps he had been conscious when he hit the barn door. He didn't even attempt to steer, tearing dead straight across the scrubland, rejoining the track, then continued over it as the horrified prison guards skidded to a halt. The Suzuki reached the other side of the track, smashed into a barbed wire fence, and launched itself into the void. Briefly, it seemed to hang in the air. Then it plunged down, following the sheer edge of the rock in a long, terrible descent towards the sea. Halfway down, it hit a boulder. There was a single explosion as it burst into flames. Some somersaulted, then continued on its way. It was upside down when it hit the water. For a moment it rested there, the flames licking upwards, as if trying to set the sea alight. Then it sank. A few pieces of broken metal rolled down the cliff face. Apart from that, there was nothing left. The nearest Land Rover came to a halt, and the driver got out. Gradually, more guards appeared, hurrying across the grass to peer over the edge beside the broken fence. Below them, turned to one side, the city of Gibraltar lay spread out. The high rises facing the sea. The Mediterranean itself was a brilliant blue, the sun throwing a million shimmering reflections across the surface. "Did you see that?" someone asked. "Poor bastard. You'd think he did it on purpose. He didn't even try to get back on the road. He could still be alive. Forget it. No one ever survived that. He'll have drowned. He didn't burn to death first. Poor sod. He was only 15. There would have to be inquiry. Of course, the most critical question would be how the gun had been smuggled into the prison. One of the guards must have been bribed. But which one? Which organisation had been behind the attempt to escape? How could they have known about the existence of the prison in the first place? An ambulance was already on its way to take Dr. Flint to St. Bernard's Hospital in the middle of Gibraltar City. As the last person to see Julius Grief alive, she might be able to fill in a few details. The governor would have to fly to London to report at the highest levels. They would serve reprimands all round and inevitable tightening of security. There were now 6 prisoners instead of 7. Julius Grief was dead, and although his frogman would be sent to the seabed, there was very little chance that any of his remains would be discovered in the wreckage of the car. Well, he wouldn't be missed. He was only a kid. But he was a mad kid, not like any of the other prisoners had liked him. Perhaps it was better way this way. Nobody knew the truth. The trick had been played inside the old barn. During the seconds when Julius Grief had been out of sight, as instructed, he had driven into the building, smashing through a door that had been specially weakened for just this purpose. A whole team of Scorpio agents, 6 of them, had been waiting for him inside the barn. As he skidded to a halt, a second identity Suzuki Jimmy had burst out of the other side, but this one had no driver. Instead, it was radio-controlled with a dummy Julius strapped to its wheel, almost invisible behind all the cracks. It didn't have to travel very far. In fact, it had been a simple task to guide it across the open patch of land, through the fence and over the edge. And while the guards were watching the fall, the explosion, the Scorpio team had got to work. The original Suzuki had been hastily covered with a tarpaulin and then with straw. Julius had been led to a pit with a sliding trapdoor constructed in the floor. There was enough room for him and all the agents to bundle in together, and within seconds they had disappeared. If anyone from the prison had thought to look inside the barn after the crash, they would have found it to be quite abandoned, containing a few bits of old machinery, a haystack and some moldy old bags of animal feed, but nobody did. Everything had happened exactly as Scorpia had intended. As far as the world was concerned, Julius Grief was dead, and nobody was watching that night as a fishing boat with a single smiling passenger slid out of the Gibraltar harbour beneath a full moon and a starry sky and began its journey south. Chapter I'm reading you, the last chapter of part 1, chapter 6, Secrets and Lies. The report was marked top secret with the 2 words stamped on the cover in red ink. But in fact, there was no need for that. For them, only 3 copies had been printed: one for Alan Blunt and the head of MI6 Special Operations, one for his deputy, Miss Jones, and one for the chief science officer. And since almost everything they did was secret in one way or another, they hardly needed to be reminded. Sometimes Miss Blunt worked how many tens of thousands of documents had passed across the polished surface of his desk, here on the 16th floor in the building that called itself Royal and General Bank in Liverpool Street, London. Each one of them had told its dirty little story. Some had led nowhere, while others had demanded instant action. An operation might be set up on the other side of the world, and they just set out to run it. How many people had died on the turn of a page? And there wouldn't be many more files coming his way. Alan Blunt sat back in his chair and looked around him, his mind still sifting through the details. What he had just read, he had occupied it for so many years. They have described it with his eyes closed right down to the last paperclip. It was simply furnished with an oak desk and a scattering of chairs on a neutral carpet, or a couple of paintings had been hung on the walls recently, landscapes that were barely worth examining. There was a shelf full of reference books that had never been opened. Rooms said a lot about the people who occupied them. Blunt had made sure that this room said nothing at all. Soon he would be leaving it. The new Prime Minister said there was time to make changes, so the entire department was being reorganised. But Blunt didn't know who would be taking his place. He rather suspected it might be Miss Jones. She hadn't said anything to him, of course, but nor would he have expected her to. He had very much hoped that she would be promoted. She'd be recruited straight from Cambridge University, bringing her with first-class degree in political science. There had been tragedies in her life, the loss of her husband and two children, but she had risen above them. She had a brilliant mind, but wondered if the Prime Minister would be smart enough to recognise her talents. He had thought of sending a memo down to 10 Downing Street. He decided against it. They could make the decision for themselves. What did the future hold for him? Blunt was in his early 50s, nowhere near retirement age. He would certainly be given a knighthood in the New Year honours, his name appearing for celebrities and civil servants. For services to government and inland security, he would be something nice and bland like that. He might be offered the dictatorship or a bank, a real one this time. He considered writing a book, but there was no real point. He had signed this Official Secrets Act. If he took the secrets out of his life, there would be nothing left. Briefly, he found himself examining the empty chairs opposite him. Blunt was not an emotional man, but he couldn't stop himself remembering some of the men and women who sat there. He had given them the orders, and they had gone, often not to return. Danvers, Wilson, Rigby, Morton, and Singh, who had done well in Afghanistan under his cover, had been blown, and John Ryder, but Blunt would never have dreamed of saying so, but he had always had a special regard for the agent who had finally assassinated on the orders of Scorpius, just to seal these leavings for the south of France with his young wife. John Ryder had been a much more efficient agent than his young brother Ian. And then, of course, there was Alice Ryder, who had in many ways surpassed them both. Blunt had half smiled to himself. He had known from the very start there was something special about the 14-year-old and he had refused to listen to voices that insisted he was mad to bring a schoolboy into the world of espionage. As had been the perfect weapon because he was so unexpected. He had achieved something else very few agents had managed. He had been sent out on 8 missions and he had survived. In a way, though, it had been Blunt's undoing. When the Prime Minister had found out that MI6 was not just a teenager, but one who was under 16. He had hit the roof when he went against every rule in the book. The public would have been horrified if the facts that he had ever leaked out. And, of course, the Prime Minister would have shared some of the blame, even though it had nothing to do with him. Blunt had no doubt that Alex was the reason he had been asked to step down. He had also been told in no uncertain terms that Alex was not to be used again, nor replaced. So that was that. In a way, Blunt was glad. He had seen enough body bags. It would have been difficult to look at one that was child size. The file. Very unusual, but Blunt had let his mind wander. He forced himself to focus again. 48 hours ago, a body had been found floating in the Thames just east of the Southwark Bridge. The body was that middle-aged man, wearing a suit and tie, and he had been shot in the back of the neck. Identification had not been difficult, because the man only had one eye and had once served in the Israel army, which still held the medical records. His name was Levi Kroll, and he was known to be an active agent, indeed one of the founding members of Scorpia. As soon as the connection had been made, the red lights had begun to flash, and the file had been passed to Special Operations. It seemed almost incredible that such a senior member of Scorpia had been murdered, and even more so that his body should have been allowed to be found. It begged all sorts of questions. What was Kroll doing in London to begin with? Was it just some way connected to the appearance of Zeldin Curse just a few months ago at the British Museum? There was no records of Kroll having entered the country, though that was hardly surprising, as he would have had at least a dozen different identities. Who had killed him? According to the report, he had taken a .300 Winchester short magnum bullet in the back of the neck, possibly fired by a Belgian FN Special Police rifle from a distance around 5 meters. Could a rifle organisation have declared war on Scorpia? Blunt considered the possibility. There was no doubt that Scorpia's reputation had declined in the past 12 months. No group could well have decided to steal its territory. There were several clues mentioned in the report. Blunt had underlined them in green, putting the star behind them in the margin. The MI6 investigators had suggested that Kroll might have been in Egypt before ending up dead in London. The shirt he had been wearing when he died had been purchased at a shop in the Arcadia Mall overlooking the Nile. It was made by Daily Dress, an expensive Egyptian manufacturer. It was part of their latest spring collection, so it must have been bought recently. Of course, the shirt could have been a present, but that was unlikely. They had trawled through hundreds of hours of CCTV footage from all 4 of the London airports, concentrating on flights that had come in from Egypt. Finally, their perseverance had paid off. A man with a beard and an eye patch had indeed come. I didn't indeed. Indeed. Had indeed come off of a British Midland. An eye patch had indeed come off on a British Midland flight from Cairo. The day before Kroll had been washed up. He had been carrying 2 items which gave the MI6 man to play with. For the first of these was a crocodile skin wallet in his inner pocket from Cartier in Paris and fairly new. It contained several credit cards in the name of good man, which must have been identity he had chosen for this visit to England. The cards had been checked for their credit history. Only one purchase had been made. Good man had bought 3 magazines and a newspaper at Heathrow Airport. The newspapers was the Times educational supplement, normally read by teachers and academics. Blunt had drawn a line beside this and added a question mark. The wallet also contained magnetic key cards such as what might be used in any hotel in the world. It was unmarked and, Blunt knew, very hard to trace. Could have been carrying £350 in different currencies: British pounds, American dollars, and Egyptian pounds. No connection with Cairo. Only the wallet had held a ticket stub from an opera in Milan, dated from 1 month ago. A receipt for dinner at Harry's bar in Venice, and a photograph of a 10-year-old boy with his arm around a Rottweiler, his son. It wasn't even known if he was married. But even of the greater interest was that it was the iPhone that had been found in the same pocket as the wallet. Of course, the water had almost completely destroyed it, but even so, the MI6 technicians had managed to retrieve a few tiny scraps of information from his memory. These had been printed on a separate sheet for Blunt and laid out in front of him. Progress. The Vicar, Shafik, 45. Payment, 30th of May, the 3rd of June. Target. Blunt examined the words, searching for any possible associations. Assuming that referred to a Scorpion operation. Cole was unusually careless to enter anything into his mobile phone. But then, of course, he would have known he was about to die. He was about to die. Dates more than 3 weeks ago rang a faint bell. Although they were referring to June or July, but the target mentioned in the last line, or could he be insane? That would certainly explain the need for payment. And what of the Vicar? The word sat at the top page, underlined. They would suggest some sort of operation involving religion. Although you wouldn't expect to find a Vicar in the Middle East. He would have thought of an imam would be more likely. It was a puzzle, but Blunt didn't need to waste any more mental energy trying to decipher it. Half a dozen different departments within Special Operations had been working on the note from the moment it had been found, and he had called it a meeting for 9 o'clock that morning, expecting to hear results. If on a cue, there was a knock at the door. Miss Jones entered, followed by a casually dressed younger woman with fair hair and freckles. This was Samantha Redwing. He was only 27, but he had risen quickly through the ranks of MI6 to become Chief Science Officer. Redwing had a photographic memory of the analytic skills of a world-class chess player. I'm a chess player. Surprisingly, she was also very normal, with a boyfriend who worked in advertising, a flat in Notting Hill Gate, and a proper social life. Blunt thought she might be unique. The two women sat down, they each carrying their copy of the Scoria file. Blunt nodded at them. Good morning. What progress do we have on this business with Levy Crawl? We've made some headway. Miss Jones opened her file. She was dressed, as always, in dark colours, which with her jet black hair and black eyes, it had not just business-like, as she was on her way to a funeral. The next head of MI6. She noticed a sheaf of papers stapled to the original report. She had, of course, come prepared. First of all, Kroll had been in the water for approximately 10 hours before he was found, suggesting that he was shot around 11 o'clock at night. We've examined the tidal reports for the Thames, and if he was going to end up being washed ashore at Southwark, then he would have to enter water further east, probably somewhere around Woolwich. That was close to the city airport. Question formed in Blunt's mind, but he didn't interrupt, as his deputy considered. We've been focusing on efforts of the electronic keycard and the information we were able to retrieve from his iPhone. Miss Jones went on. It's a shame that all his telephone numbers were lost. The phone itself won't tell us very much. According to the serial number, it was purchased in New York. We're still trying to trace payment deals. We think that we may have decoded the actual words. They don't mean very much on their own, but you have to put it together with the other items that Kroll was carrying. The key to it all is the Times educational supplement which he bought at Heathrow. I have the edition here. She produced a copy and laid it on the desk. What would a man like Kroll want with a paper like this? Was he interested in something that might involve a school? If we assume that June means June, not July, then the dates 3rd of May to the 3rd of June, 30th of May to the 3rd of June, to 3rd of June. This happens to coincide with the last half term in many schools in the UK, all around Europe. We know they're cool. Could just come from Cairo and Shafik. The name on the phone could well be Egyptian. So, he might be interested in a school somewhere in Egypt. That's exactly what the conclusion we arrived at, and that's where we've been directing our attention. Miss Jones unwrapped a peppermint and slid it into her mouth. I waited for her to continue. There are 28 men and women with the surname Shafik working in different schools around Egypt, he said. 11 are in Cairo. To start with, we assume that the figure 45 referred to their age. That narrowed the field to 3, and only one in Cairo, Miss Alifa Shafik, headmistress at primary school. We checked her out, and there's nothing that could possibly make her of interest to an organisation like Scorpia. The school is in a poor area of the city that we decided that trail nowhere. Blunt nodded his agreement. He was quietly impressed. Miss Jones had moved quickly. There was no doubting the logic of what she had said. Shafik is a fairly common name. He muttered. The link with the educational supplement is a fairly common name. Shafik is a fairly common name. He muttered. The link with the educational supplement is interesting. It may well be that school is involved. It could be Alexandria or Port Suffolk or even Luxor. Do you have any more specific? As a matter of fact, we do. Mr. Jones flicked through the pages of the paper. We read the Times educational supplement from cover to cover, looking for stories that relate to Egypt, trying to find a connection. There were none, but in the back there was an advertisement for a new head of security at the Cairo International College of Arts and Education, which is Sheikh Zayed City at the outskirts of Cairo. It seemed like quite a coincidence, so we contacted the school and we discovered something rather interesting. They needed a new security chef because their last one was run over and killed. He was arriving for work. His name, as it happens, was Mohammed Shafik. The driver didn't stop. The accident, as if it was an accident, took place nearly 2 months ago on 4th of May. The man said at the page, 4th of the 5th, he muttered. It's the same numbers. Exactly, so we assume that's why Delgin Curse was in London. That's why Delgin Curse was in London, Blunt babbled. Their school has to recruit a new security man. Scorpia could have been trying to get someone inside. He quickly read the advertisement in the Times educational supplement. The local recruitment office in London was handling the appointment when it was nowhere near Woolwich, the place where Kroll might have been killed. Did this agency find anyone to take Mr. Shafik's place, he asked. Yes, the new man is Eric Gunter, Scottish mother, German father. He was brought up in Glasgow. He spent his time with 1st Battalion Scots Guard. Before he was wounded in Afghanistan, he was awarded the Military Cross Courage, and I have his file here. He passed it across. Blunt scanned it briefly. Gunter had come under fire while he was on patrol in Helmand province. According to the report, he had almost certainly saved the lives of his entire platoon, but he had taken 4 bullets himself and had been invalid home. What about this business with the vicar? Grant asked. Does the school have any chaplain? No, Miss Jones glanced at the chief science office, who was sitting silently through all this. Reverend Vicar wanted a great deal of time, she said. It didn't seem to be at any all Reverend. First we assumed it might be a code name. You remember that some years ago we dealt with an insane. It was known only as the Price. But in the end, Redwing worked it out. It's a mistake, Redwing explained. If you take the International of the Cairo International College of Arts and Education, KIK, and type them into an iPhone, the machine auto-corrects them and you get the word vicar. With the final confirmation, Jones added, Scorpius operation has to involve this school. But I have to make sure. I checked the key card. I sent Crawley, you know, the person Crawley, not Crawley, the person called Crawley, out to Cairo, and he reported back this morning. The school is guarded, fenced in, monitored 24 hours a day. But there was a security leak. The key opened the door into the kitchen and sat in silence. Outside an ambulance raced along Liverpool Street, the scream of its siren hanging in the air. What would it find at the end of its journey? Another life or another death? Tell me about the school, he said. Miss Jones was ready for this. She wouldn't have come to Blunt's office without being fully briefed. The KIK, or CICAE, makes an interesting Scorpia target, he said. Target, that was another word that had been retrieved from the phone. The school maintains a very large security staff. With a good reason, it has about 400 children from countries all over the world. We scroll down the names, like who are the rich and famous. They've got parents who are all oil millionaires, politicians, diplomats, sheikhs, princes, and even pop stars. The Syrian president has a son there. The British ambassador to Egypt has a daughter. The chairman of Texas Oil, one of the biggest petrol companies in America, has no fewer than 3 children at the CICAE. Can you imagine if one of them was kidnapped or worse, still killed? Suppose Scorpio was planning to take over the whole school. They could threaten 400 of the most powerful parents on the planet. They'd have enough leverage to start a world war. We can't be sure that's what they're intending, John said. Suddenly something entirely different flickered across his consciousness. 17 years as head of MI6 Special Operations had turned his brain into a computer that never stopped functioning. Always there were connections. What was it? Oh yes, the report that had crossed his desk a week ago. The death of a boy in Gibraltar. Julius grief. All the talk of school children had reminded him. He considered it for a moment, then moved on. The boy had tried to escape in a car and driven off a cliff. The body still hadn't been recovered, but there was no way he could have survived, so that was that. It couldn't be related. Why else could they target a school? Miss Jones asked. Let's examine the possibilities. Blunt thought for a second. The eyes behind the square-framed glasses were bleak. He was weeks away from retirement. He hadn't expected this. Scorpia is planning an attack of some sort of international school in Cairo. They're sending Levy Kroll to London for reasons that are unclear, but which seem to be connected to the recruitment of this new head of security. Maybe their curse was in London, and February, and in it for exactly the same purpose. It would seem likely that they've put their own man inside the school. Although looking at the file, this man Gunter seems to be beyond reproach. He is a war hero, for heaven's sake. However, I agree with you. It seems a bit of a coincidence that the last set of security could have been taken out by a hit-and-run driver. But we have to assume that Kroll was killed by a rival organisation, because if he would have been honest by his own people, they'd have made sure he had nothing in his pockets when he was found. In fact, the body wouldn't have been found at all. It seemed to me that there are two questions we have to consider. This most likely explanation of what is occurred. What should we do? You could warn the school, Miss Jones suggested. I am not so sure. Warning them about what? What can we only guess the Scorpion is planning? We have no idea. What is going to happen when we could talk to the Egyptian government. They are unlikely to listen to us. Besides, we look at the bigger pictures. What about the Syrians, Americans, and the other families? We tell them all this. We'll have the other intelligence agencies in the world at one another's throats. We'll have half the intelligence agencies in the world at one another's throats. It would all turn into a complete mess. If Scorpion knew we were onto them, they might decide not to proceed. Exactly. Mr. Jones saw the glint in Blunt's eye. Suddenly she understood. You want them to go ahead, she said. I want them to try, Blunt agreed. But you could turn this whole thing into a trap. Just for once, we're one step ahead of them. If they decide to make a move, there will be an opportunity to finish them once and for all. But you wouldn't seriously take risks with the lives of children at this international school. Of course not. We'll put an agent inside. We'll keep an eye on the situation. The moment Scorpia show themselves, we'll be ready. And what we need, he began. No! It was unheard of for Miss Jones to interrupt her superior, but she did so now. You can't. Blunt blinked slowly. You know what I'm thinking. Of course she did. Miss Jones had spent hundreds of hours with Blunt. Soon she might replace him. She knew him inside out. You can't use Alex, she said. I'm sure you're right, Miss Jones, but you must admit that this would have exactly been the sort of mission for him. Put a 14-year-old into a school and nobody would look twice. Just like a point law. Alex is 15 now, Miss Jones reminded him, and that business in Kenya was the end of it. Alan. She didn't often use his Christian name when there were other people in the room, but for now she ignored Red Wing, who had lapsed back into silence, waiting her turn. He was badly hurt. Burnt! He was in hospital again. We both agreed. He's been through enough. I'm not sure I agreed. The years of order from Downing Street, Miss Jones didn't dare disobey an instruction that came direct from the Prime Minister, nor when she might be weeks away from taking over. I still suggest that we put one of our people inside, he said. Miss Jones relaxed. As a teacher or a cleaner, get Crawley onto it. Smithers can provide surveillance and communications equipment. Meantime, just keep an eye on all known Scorpion agents, particularly if they show up anywhere near the Egyptian border. Turn to Red Wing, as if noticing her for the first time. Your thoughts, Red Wing? Excuse me. I just have a couple to add, sir. Frederick said. I have no argument with anything that Miss Jones had said, but it does seem a little odd that Kroll should have flown into Heathrow and then travelled all the way across London to Woolwich. If that was really where he was killed, why didn't he just fly into City Airport? It would have been much closer. Blunt was pleased. The same thought had already occurred to him. There are no flights directly from Cairo to City Airport, he said, although it makes you wonder why he didn't use a private jet. What really puzzles me is this medical report. First of all, from the contents of the dead man's stomach, we know that the last meal he ate included snails, roast pork, potatoes, and some kind of dessert made with Grand Marnier. Included snails with. It's the sort of meal you might eat in Paris or London, but it's not what you'd expect from a man who'd just flown in from Cairo. What do you mean? Well, even in first class, he wouldn't have been served snails on the plane, and pork is unusual and is an unusual choice. Muslim country. For the matter, we found no Egyptian spices or herbs of any sorts, no rice or falafel. Of course, he could have been staying in an international hotel. He may eat Egyptian food, but it still feels strange. And there's something else. Yes, sir, we've examined the body. We found a tiny fragment of glass buried in the back of the neck. If he had been driven in by the impact of the bullet, Edwin paused. It's entirely possible that Cole was shot in London, somewhere close to the flames. He will be standing on one of the banks or perhaps on a bridge. He was shot and fell into the water. But the fragment of the glass tells another story. He was inside on the other side of a window, in which case the body was then taken and dumped in the river. But it was what happened. What was the point? It was impossible that the body was meant to be found. And you're suggesting that the note was planted. Blunt considered. But why would Scorpion want us to know what they were doing? It doesn't make sense to me, sir, Edward admitted. There was no silence. Blunt made his decision. We'll go ahead and put someone in the school, he said. It may be a complete waste of time, but I can't see that it will do any harm. Still, it's a shame to waste the resources of an active agent. Miss Close answered him once again. She saw what was going through his mind. Anatole would already be on the plane to Cairo, where if Blunt had his way, it wasn't going to happen. Alex Friday was history. Miss Jones had never said as much to him, but she had promised it to herself. No matter what her own future within MI6, it was one promise she was determined not to break. That was me reading you the end of part 1, Scorpio. And then maybe in the next thing you know, it'll be part 2, Alex. And then chapter 7, Angle of Attack. Alex, you overslept again. Get yourself out of bed. That's the first episode. But anyway, so goodbye everyone, and thank you for listening to me reading you the end of part 1, Scorpio Rising. And we're going on to part 2, Scorpio Rising. Goodbye everyone, and thank you for listening to this.